Exactly 484 days after starting the invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's regime faced a coup attempt that has exposed the great weaknesses of a country that is falling apart. In late February 2022, Vladimir Putin came close to taking over Kiev. Now his control over Moscow, and perhaps all of Russia, has been put at risk. The question we're all wondering now is, what the hell has actually happened? Why did it happen? And probably the most important question of all, what can we expect from now on? Well, in this video, we're going to tell you all about it. Pay close attention, because there will be things that you already know, but others that I'm pretty sure are going to surprise you. Let's get started. Saturday, 24th of June 2023. Armed, geared up, and ready for combat. The troops of a warlord speed through Russian territory to take over Moscow. The Kremlin, meanwhile, cornered and stunned, tries to stop the advance of this armed column by setting up barricades, cutting off roads, and sabotaging bridges. Everything is in vain. The warlord's troops advance relentlessly. VisualPolitik viewers, on this occasion, this was no Hollywood movie. We're not looking at a script written by a motivated screenwriter or anything like that. This time, the story is completely true. We have all witnessed it. On June 23rd and 24th, 2023, the unthinkable became reality. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, posed the greatest challenge to Vladimir Putin in the history of modern Russia. However, in this video, we're not going to get into the details of who Prigozhin is, how the Wagner group works, or how it was possible that he came to have 50,000 soldiers and achieved Russia's only major victory in Ukraine since April 2022, Bakhmut. We won't do that because we've already talked about this in several videos that will link for you in the description. Instead, this time we're going to focus on the unique story that is more worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster than current news broadcasts. And the first thing to know is what happened and how we got here. Well, you see, the high command of the Russian military and the leader of the Wagner group have been at each other's throats for months, and don't think they do it privately. Prigozhin has given interviews, made videos, and posted on social media to denounce the incompetence and corruption of Russia's military bigwigs, particularly Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov. For its part, after the capture of Bakhmut, the Ministry of Defense launched a plan to reduce the growing influence of the Wagner group. To do this, they would enlist the recruits of this group into the army and put all its structure under the control of Minister Shoigu, a move that was, of course, completely unacceptable to the boss of Wagner. After all, this would have meant the dissolution of Wagner in practice. His response? Increase his accusations against the military high command of corruption and gross incompetence. And so, the tension between both parties escalated like the temperature of a volcano on the verge of eruption. However, the definitive standoff was set in motion on Friday 23rd of June, when Prigozhin accused the Russian military of attacking his mercenary group's camps, killing numerous Wagner fighters. He specifically blamed the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and promised to retaliate. And he certainly did. In a 30-minute video, the leader of the Wagner group let loose. He said everything. He acknowledged that the war in Ukraine was not justified, that the Russian government elites were a bunch of corrupt people, and that everything had been orchestrated to fill the pockets of the current bosses.
На 24 февраля ничего сверхординарного не было. Сейчас уже Министерство обороны пытается обмануть общественность, пытается обмануть президента и рассказать историю о том, что со стороны Украины была безумная агрессия, и они собирались вместе со всем блоком НАТО на нас напасть. Поэтому спецоперация, так называемая 24 февраля, она была начата совершенно по другим причинам.
Of course, this would only be the beginning. The next step was to occupy the city of Rostov-on-Don, an important city of more than 1 million inhabitants, and an absolutely crucial military center for Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. This definitely meant crossing a point of no return.
Это удар в спину стране и президенту. Это государственный переворот.
And as the Wagner group prepared to occupy Rostov-on-Don, in the early hours of Saturday 24th of June, the Prosecutor General of Russia announced that Prigozhin was being investigated for orchestrating a rebellion. And just a few hours later, Vladimir Putin himself addressed the nation and accused his former ally of being a traitor. He promised to punish those responsible as harshly as possible. Check it out.
Повторю, любая внутренняя смута – смертельная угроза для нашей государственности, для нас, как нации. Это удар по России, по нашему народу. И наши действия по защите Отечества от такой угрозы будут жесткие. Все, кто сознательно встал на путь предательства, кто готовил вооруженный мятеж, встал на путь шантажа и террористических методов, понесут неименуемое наказание.
Of course, the climax of this kind of standoff was yet to come. Shortly after, the Wagner troops confirmed what they had already announced. They were heading to Moscow. They called it a march for justice. And keep in mind, this was no joke. Even though Wagner's operation did not show any major troop and equipment deployment, the Kremlin had to implement the plans it had from the Soviet era to defend the capital. That's pretty crazy, right? In anticipation of the arrival of Prigozhin's troops, barricades were placed, roads were blocked, some bridges were sabotaged, and all available forces were deployed. According to the plans, Moscow would be under the custody of the 4th Guards, Kantemirovskaya Tank Division, and the 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division. It is estimated that they numbered about 6,000 men in total. Along with them, units from the Spetsnaz Special Forces, the National Guard, and the police. In the end, none of this was necessary. As you all know, in the evening, and when the mercenary group was already very close to the capital, a kind of truce was announced. The Wagner group backed off after having traversed hundreds of kilometers without any opposition, and after having shot down 6 helicopters and a plane from the Russian military. Despite this, Russia has withdrawn any charges of rebellion. But, as I said earlier, VisualPolitik viewers, all this is something that I am absolutely sure, absolutely certain that you all already know. Even so, there are a few questions that we still need to ask. Why did Prigozhin set out on such an adventure? What does this coup incursion really mean? Why was the Wagner group's attempted coup suddenly halted when they were so close to Moscow? And perhaps the most important question of all, what could all this mean for the future of Russia? Well, let's take a look.
Chronicle of a disaster foretold.
We've already told you on VisualPolitik in a bunch of videos, beyond all the existing propaganda. The truth is that the Ukraine war has been a colossal disaster for Russia. Almost no Russian is gaining anything, and most are losing. The economy in the country is suffering, and future projections are very poor. Now, Russians are much more isolated, and freedom of speech has been even further reduced, if that was even possible. For their part, the big oligarchs have lost a fortune, and a lot of freedom. Let's just say that their luxurious lifestyle of traveling and being feted around the world has been seriously compromised. But of course, the worst consequences have taken place in Ukraine. Since the start of the war, the casualties have been brutal. Russia has lost a large part of its military force, and now, to top it all off, they are on the defensive. The Ukrainian counterattack may be slower than expected, but it is severely punishing the already exhausted Russian troops. And keep in mind that this is not just us saying so. Prigozhin himself is saying it, a guy who has been the visible face of Russia's military effort for months. Take a look.
На земле сейчас, на сегодняшний день, российская армия отступает на Запорожском, Херсонском направлении. ВСУ продавливают российскую армию. Мы умываемся кровью. Резервы никто не дает. Управления никакого нет. По-прежнему истерики, в которых начальник генштаба после стакана водки визжит, как баба базарная, как свинья. Телефон требуя вернуть позиции.
But it's not just about Prigozhin. The truth is that the data that is becoming known does not invite optimism for Russia. For example, data from the Ukrainian armed forces, largely acknowledged by Prigozhin himself, suggest that Russia's casualties are not only much higher than Ukraine's, but twice as high as when the Kherson offensive began in the summer of 2022. And the same can be said of equipment losses. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Let's see, Josh, Ukrainian figures? Are you kidding? Those are more made up than the burgers in TV ads. Well, yes, it is very likely that they are, but it is also true that if they were made up now, they were also made up in the summer of 2022, and that Western data reflects a similar trend, and that Prigozhin himself is also acknowledging it. And that's why what matters to us is not the specific data, but the trend the war is following.
3-4 раза больше, чем это в документах подается наверх. А то, что подается, это в 10 раз меньше, чем говорят по телевизору. Санитарные потери в день составляют некоторые дни до 1000 человек.
We will talk about this in great detail in an upcoming video here on VisualPolitik. What matters to us now is that this is not something new. For months, the leader of the Wagner Group has denounced Russian bigwigs for not providing his men with the necessary ammunition and equipment. He has also blamed them for the great losses suffered. And guess what? This is something fundamental. The military failure in Ukraine is forcing Russia to look for culprits on one hand, and on the other hand, it is creating cracks in the system that many may want to exploit to increase their power, which is exactly what Prigozhin seems to have been doing over the last few months. Meanwhile, he's washing his hands of responsibility and pointing to others as guilty before those others point their fingers at him. At the same time, he's climbing up the power ladder. That explains why the leader of Wagner has repeatedly demanded the dismissal of the high-ups of the Russian government and has constantly berated them. Not surprisingly, Shoigu and Gerasimov have not stood idly by, and that is how we have come to this point. But hold on a moment, because this whole story leaves us with quite a few questions. Why weren't the military, including the Air Force, decisively mobilized to repel the coup? Was there mistrust in the Kremlin that some division might not obey orders and instead side with the rebels if the tension was raised even further? Why did Putin himself accuse Wagner members of being traitors in the morning and said they would receive harsh punishment, only to let them go scot-free hours later? Did they not have a clear idea in the Kremlin that they could easily squash such resistance? Why resort to an intermediary like Lukashenko? Were they afraid that Moscow could be lost, or at least part of the capital with the political blow that this would have signaled? Why were Putin and the rest of the government officials so far away? Did the president really abandon Moscow for fear of what might happen? Does he no longer trust his inner circle? How is it possible that, as confirmed, US intelligence knew about Wagner's intentions for days, and yet the Kremlin seemed to be taken by surprise with no effective preparations? Is it that information is no longer flowing? Why did Prigozhin dash towards Moscow, and when he was so close, he turned around apparently without any concrete success? Was he perhaps expecting the support of some faction critical of the government that ultimately did not materialize? Might this have involved the commander of the aerospace forces, General Surovikin, and the deputy chief of the GRU, Lieutenant General Alexeyev, who made somewhat strange statements calling on Wagner forces to desist? Were they possibly detained or under duress when they made these statements? Could it be that the leader of Wagner has detected a growing distance between the military ranks and the government, and therefore thought that his action could trigger a domino effect, one that, in the end, didn't happen? We don't know. But this is the theory suggested by Western intelligence services. It could explain why he turned around, and also why Putin did not want to mobilize the armed forces or confront Wagner directly. In any case, you can see that this whole episode generates a whole lot of questions, for which we can offer nothing more than speculation at this point. But listen, whether it was well organized or not, and regardless of the real risk it posed, the truth is that Prigozhin's coup had made one thing very, very clear.
Mafia is as mafia does. Whatever deal was reached today, blood has been spilled and Putin's illusion of invincibility is gone. He and his cronies tasted real fear. Moscow was threatened. Garry Kasparov.
Putin's power is not what it used to be.
Is the boss in question?
During the Ukraine war, the Wagner Group, and particularly its leader, have gained more and more prominence. First as the leader of the main operations, then as a scourge on the military leadership, and lately also as a protector of the unfortunate Russian soldiers. To do this, he has not hesitated to record videos condemning the loss of Russian soldiers, has given gifts to their widows and mothers, and above all, has spoken truths about the war that no one else in Russia dared to say. Well, these are moves that sell very well in Russia, which has increased his popularity exponentially. You only have to look at how he left Rostov-on-Don amidst applause and cheers after agreeing on a truce with the government. But you may be wondering, why did Putin allow this guy to relentlessly attack his government for so long? Well, one of the reasons being considered is that with all of these condemnations, he was in fact helping the Russian president. Let me explain. Putin's good friend and ally was putting figures like Shoigu and Gerasimov in the hot seat. They were the real culprits for the bad state of affairs, not the president. Nevertheless, everything changed with his video on Friday, the 23rd of June, because it's one thing to criticize a lack of ammunition, and something entirely different to openly say that the arguments to justify the invasion were a sham. And that's why Putin went on TV to say implicitly that Prigozhin was a traitor. So, what's the problem? That he's had to basically retract his statement. It seems he is no longer going to pursue him, and that is a problem, because it makes it clear that the boss of Russia no longer has as much power as before.
I am forced to admit with bitterness that the Russian Federation has taken one more step towards its definitive and irrevocable death. Viktor Imantovich Alksnis, former member of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and former deputy of the State Duma of the Russian Federation. Today, the world saw that the bosses of Russia do not control anything. Nothing at all. Complete chaos. Zelensky.
Yes, it is true that it appears that according to the agreement reached, Prigozhin does seem to be leaving Russia. But will this mean that he will leave behind his growing influence? Will he hand over pulling the strings? As you can see, there are serious doubts. It also remains to be seen what will happen with the military leadership. If Putin makes changes, that could be interpreted as part of the agreement with Wagner. But whatever happens, if anything is clear, it is that all this has been a huge blow for Putin. The Russian president has caused a disaster in Ukraine, is currently losing the war, and now this. Look at what Russian journalist Mikhail Zygar said back in January.
President Vladimir Putin of Russia, it seems, has finally noticed that the war in Ukraine created a dangerous competitor to his power, Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Not surprisingly, the mutiny went much further. Putin no longer instills the fear of the past, and that is the worst thing that can happen to an autocrat. In regimes like this, the president's power is essentially based on his ability to intimidate, instill respect, and punish any dissent. But this time, we have seen how an organization of 25,000 mercenaries took over the nerve center of operations for the Ukraine war, and advanced towards Moscow without any repercussions.
The fact that this was moderated by Lukashenko strikes me as embarrassing in the extreme. Putin needs someone else to solve his problems? Sam Green, Russian politics expert, director of CEPA, and professor at King's College London.
And don't forget that elections are to be held in March 2024. Yes, we know, in Russia, the elections are more rigged than the selection process of the Qatar World Cup. But even so, let's see if Putin manages to make it, and if he manages to run for re-election. Think about it. The great proposal, the great commitment of the Russian president has always been to rescue Russia from anarchy and restore its greatness. But now, all of that is shattered. Russia is not stronger. Its military is getting worse and worse. There is no prosperity in the country. The great oligarchs are losing. And to top it all off, the chaos is so great that a warlord can walk calmly across the country, threatening to occupy the capital without anything happening to him. And as if all that weren't bad enough, the agreement reached with Wagner seems to entail the departure of this armed group from a war that has not yet ended. And keep in mind that, so far, this group has been crucial.
Wagner was the only successful element in the Russian invasion for a year, and its success was very limited and focused on one small city, and its tactics were barbaric even for Wagner personnel. But they at least achieved something. The Russian army couldn't. Andriy Zagorodnyuk, former Minister of Defense for Ukraine.
The impression this leaves us with is that of a decaying country. And take note, because there are precedents. In 1991, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev managed to survive a coup. Despite this, just 4 months later, he was out of the government. The coup highlighted his enormous weakness. Are we currently witnessing a very similar situation? We will talk about all of this in a future video here on VisualPolitik. For now, the floor is yours. What do you think of the Wagner Group's coup? Who do you think has lost more, Prigozhin or Putin? Do you think the Russian leader will be able to recover from all these blows? How will this affect the war in Ukraine? Leave us your thoughts in the comments and let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Take care, I'll see you next time.